All right, so today we're going to be talking about emotions and stress, and we really want to reflect back on what we were talking about with motivation, because emotions and stress really tie in with motivation. If you remember the homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is when we're trying to get our physiological system back to center, right? And we use the example of feeling hungry with homeostasis. So with homeostasis, we look at it as kind of our gauge, kind of our not thermometer, try what's the thing on the wall? It's a thermometer. Oh my gosh, words eluding me. Anyway, so if we look at our centeredness, we may feel hungry. When we feel hungry, we want to reduce those physiological symptoms. We're not able to really focus. We're going through physical sensations in our body. That thermostat, that's what it was. Sorry. So think of it as a thermostat on your wall. Your thermostat, when it gets to a certain point, it kicks on. Like if it's too low, it'll kick on the heat. Or if you have air conditioning, if it's in the summer, it'll kick on the air conditioner if it's too hot. So anyway, there's that sweet spot in the middle where it tries to maintain that balance. And that's kind of what our homeostasis does, right? And we do that with stress and emotions. Our emotions really guide us into stress, and there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in this lecture. But looking at how stress impacts us is very important, because it also creates a very negative or uncomfortable physiological symptoms or features within our body, which we want to reduce. Okay, so but when it comes to emotions, all creatures in the animal kingdom, they really exhibit certain types of behavior, but only a few portions of these creatures, they experience what we would call emotions. And these are instinctive or intuitive states of mind that are symptoms of really complex cognitive functioning, right? And remember when we were talking about growth and cognitive development, this is really an extension of that. But many or most animals really display emotional states, and humans really fall into that category as well at a much higher level, as far as we know. We can experience anger, we can experience joy, we can experience depression or fear, and all of these states of mind are not always direct reflections of reason, right? Sometimes we feel them for no reason at all. Maybe it could be rainy and gloomy out, and that affects our state of mind, right? So why do we feel these? Everything about our anatomy and physiology makes some amount of sense in an evolutionary context. What is the benefit of possessing emotions? Why do we have them? What purpose do they serve in the sense of survival? I'm going to share my screen with you here, because I do have a couple graphics that I want to have you follow along with. All right. So an analysis of emotional response really in animals, it really goes all the way back to the time of Darwin himself. He compared responses in a variety of species and proposed that expressions of emotion evolved in an organism so that it can signal other organisms as to what they're going to do next, and maybe what they should do as well. And we kind of know, well, we know that we develop a sense of language earlier on in life, and that really extends out into how we express ourselves emotionally, right? And we do that through facial features, through body language, and so on. So for example, if an animal is feeling threatened, it might display a stance of aggression. The animal might bare its teeth, it may lean forward and make aggressive sounds. All these behaviors indicate the potential for violent behavior. And it does well in intimidating some percentage of other organisms nearby, which they may retreat in fear without necessitating any actual combat, or they may stand up and combat that animal, right? Thus, this type of behavior is really a quantifiable impact on the survival of an organism, and therefore it becomes a preferable trait within the gene pool. And if you remember, things that are favorable might help us to procreate or reproduce, and pass on those traits. So maybe aggression somehow has served its purpose through our gene pool, and that's why we exhibit it today, right? So submission is really on the opposite end of aggression, and thus is expressed in the opposite manner physically. Like, for example, you can see the dog in here with the downward posture and aversion of gaze and other behaviors that communicate a lack of physical retreat. This can also serve a survival purpose in reducing the chances of confrontation. So maybe on two ends of the spectrum, an organism needs to be able to show aggression and may also need to know when to retreat, when it knows it's outnumbered and outgunned, right? That's important for survival as well, okay? So emotional states really catalyze these behaviors. And in this context, we can understand how emotions really must have evolved in animals. So how does this work in the brain, at least in the human brain? One of the first theories that attempted to explain this was the James-Lange theory. And this was in the late 19th century. And this really states that sensory stimuli are received by the cortex, in which and then in turn activate both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. What we talked about with the sympathetic and parasympathetic, if you remember. And these responses in turn trigger the experience of emotion in the brain. So this means that physiological states create emotion, all right? And that's a little bit opposite of what we kind of think makes sense, right? We might think that just in our everyday layman's understanding of psychology and emotions, we might think that what we see might produce the physiological effect. But really the theory, the James-Lange theory, really maintained that autonomic activity, like change in heart rate or other involuntary responses that trigger the emotional state, that's what we experience with emotions, okay? So let's use an example here. So common sense would suggest that when we perceive a danger like a bear, I don't know if any of you have ever been out in the woods in Harrisburg or Poconos or wherever else, and walking on a trail and experience a bear. You might feel fear, which would cause the physiological reaction. That's according to our common sense theory. But instead, James-Lange theory would propose that seeing that bear would trigger a physiological reaction first, which in turn would trigger the actual feeling of fear, okay? So along came the Cannon-Bard duo, and they weren't really happy with the James-Lange theory. And so they proposed instead that a stimuli triggered both physical and the physical expression of emotion, and then also the emotional state itself as parallel processes, okay? They were noticing that physiological symptoms really take a long time to really initiate but having that mental process first and then the physiological reaction didn't really make sense because it would take way too long. But we show that really these things can happen simultaneously according to the Cannon-Bard theory. So this means that seeing the bear would trigger both a physiological and an emotional response simultaneously and independently, okay? However, we do know that modern studies have shown that neither of these models can be totally accurate. And I'll explain that a little bit later as to why. And it would seem that perception, experience of emotion, and physical response can really all influence one another together, as this diagram kind of shows here. They all are influencing each other, not independently, but we're experiencing, our mind kind of picks up on perception, it picks up on physiological, and then feeling of fear, which then kind of feeds back into the physiological and perception, okay? So another important theory looks at the limbic system. And this is comprised of, if you remember back in, I think it was chapter 2, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the fornix, the cortex of cingulate, gyrus, the septum, olfactory bulb, and most importantly, the hypothalamus, okay, which we have implicated in creating fear responses, right, if you remember. So this theory proposes that emotional states are expressed when these structures act on the hypothalamus. It could be in certain sequence, it could be in certain order, or it could be all together. But then once a hypothalamus receives these signals, they're all experienced through their action on the cortex, okay? So surprisingly, certain aspects of emotional response are really consistent across not just humans, but other primate species as well. An example of this are facial expressions that we can really tie with our close cousin, the chimpanzee, right? As you can see, they're very effective. They show a lot of expression in their faces, depending on their mood or what's happening around them. So we do know that the animal kingdom, aside from humans, really possess these emotions and being able to express them, okay? Where it was once thought that they didn't. So it was proposed that one of the most popular theories is that there are 6 primary expressions that correlate with facial expressions, okay? So I don't know, if you look at those for just a second and kind of figure out which ones are which, okay? See how well you do. All right, you ready? Hopefully you did well. But anyway, the 6 facial expressions that we have really tied, and there might be variations in there somewhere, but these are the 6 primary facial expressions of fear, anger, sadness, happiness, disgust, and surprise. And across many cultures, most cultures, we can show those, and the people in those cultures are able to pick up on them. Now, there's some limitations as to, like Asian cultures are a little less effective as far as their facial expressions, because as a collective society, it's really less appropriate to show emotions in those contexts, right? In certain situations. So certain situations might warrant different expressions, in other words. But for the most part, we can really isolate them down to those 6. All right. All right. Another theory or hypothesis, I guess you could call it, is the facial feedback hypothesis. And that proposes that simply enacting a particular facial expression can influence the onset of corresponding emotion. And there exists some evidence to support this. One of the studies that I read, and I think it might have been in your book, is the pencil. And when I have live classes, I usually use this, the pencil theory, putting the pencil in your teeth. So what I ask the students to do, I give them a comic strip and I ask them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 to how funny that comic strip is. So they put the pencil in their teeth and it kind of emulates a smile. The other group, I have them put the pencil beneath their nose and kind of scrunch, which emulates a frown. And you can try this with your family to see if this holds up. But for the most part, I find that people that have in their teeth rate that comic strip a little funnier, a little higher on the comedy scale than the people that are doing the frown face. So anyway, that's really what the facial feedback hypothesis demonstrates there. Okay. But when it comes to studies of emotion, a lot of research really focuses on fear. And this is really the emotional reaction of any immediate threat. And it's the easiest emotion to study because it's simple to infer from the behavior of many species. We see it across the animal kingdom, okay? So anyway, that's probably one of the reasons why we see it. It's a little harder to determine whether an organism or person is happy, right? They may have different leveling degrees of happiness, but for the most part, fear really emulates from us the strongest, okay? Fear tends to produce either defensive behavior meant to protect the organism from harm, or aggressive behaviors meant to threaten or harm itself, right? Or I'm sorry, threaten or harm the threat itself. So kind of reactionary. These are really instinctual behaviors that have evolved for survival purposes, right? No guessing there. And they take on a variety of forms in different mammalian species, including humans, though they often obey really the target site concept, which is really described here. This means that behaviors are meant to attack specific places on a threatening organism while protecting certain vulnerabilities vulnerable areas itself. So if you remember, I talked about how we tend to really raise our shoulders and tighten our neck muscles. That might be an indication that we're trying to protect our head or something. All right. So if we might get defensive, we might cross our arms like that. That might be a reason. The reason behind that is we're trying to protect our vital organs. Okay. We see that with dogs. What happens when you scare a dog? What happens to their tail? It kind of curves under and protects their genitalia. So there are vulnerable areas that we instinctively try and protect. Okay. So when it comes to aggressive behaviors, we can look at them as either predatory for eating or social as to establish and maintain social hierarchy. Again, if you look at dogs, they especially male dogs, hence the alpha male that exists in the communities of certain animals, right? Now, you could argue that humans have that same idea of dominance, social or maintaining social hierarchy. I'd like to think we're more evolved, but trust me, with the people I've worked with in the past, I would say I can see aggressive behavior show up with their attempt to try and maintain social hierarchy of some sort. All right. So defensive, the opposite end of that, defensive behaviors are really more varied. They're really interest-specific, defending against social aggression. We've talked about the fight or flight, right? Freezing and flight involves staying perfectly still while the threat is perceived until a certain safety zone is penetrated, at which the organism they'll attempt to flee rapidly. Okay. So that's really the idea behind the fight, flight, or freeze, is just attempting to assess within our environment what's happening. And animals engaged in risk assessment, we as humans really do this too. We scan the environment defensively. I don't think many of us burrow into the ground and hide, but we might see that. We might see similar representations of that in our behavior. Say, maybe if depression sets in or anxiety sets in, maybe we feel a little bit more comfortable not leaving our bed. That could be perceived as like burrowing or hiding behaviors, right? Or avoidance. And of course, we see maternal defense behaviors where a mother would instinctively protect her young, at times in so violent manners that it really resembles male social aggression, right? These are really hardwired into many animals and even humans in some cases. Social aggression in most species is exhibited very prominently in males, right? Sorry, guys. Typically much more so than females, with the exception that aggression is associated with the mother protecting her young. Right? That's really the difference in the two of them. And this is because the period in which testosterone is released in males around birth seems to have an effect on the organization of the nervous system, which is reinforced by further testosterone released around the time of puberty. Okay, kind of taking you back to sex ed and biology, right? However, the correlation between testosterone and aggression is really still being studied and is far more really conclusive than what we know. So we're really looking at what ways, when I teach anger management, what triggers can we identify and how can we hit them a little bit sooner before acting aggressively, right? So our understanding of fear on a mechanical level is really quite a bit more sound than really any of the other ones. Okay. So one of the studies I think your book highlighted was utilization of fear conditioning on rats, which is establishment of fear in response to what should be a neutral stimulus. If you remember back in the classical conditioning, right? We're talking about the Pavlov's dog and salivation. This type of classical conditioning, which we learned about when we were talking about memory and learning. An example of this context would be the production of an auditory tone just before an electric shock is administered. And the rat eventually responds to the tone itself with a variety of defensive behaviors and nervous system responses, right? So looking at the neural mechanisms in that rat, we can see that they produce these responses and they can be mapped through studies involving lesions and auditory pathways. And if you remember, when we produce lesions, we can affect areas of the brain. And that's kind of what they did with rats to see if they could take away that fear response or even enhance it. But these studies suggest that signals such as the tone that induces fear must reach the midbrain and then travel from there to the amygdala, as the lesions in either of these regions, they render fear conditioning ineffective, almost like these rats had no fear whatsoever. This makes sense in the context that our understanding of the amygdala as the region that receives sensory input and assigns emotional significance based on survival relevant information. Okay. So a number of pathways that carry signals from the amygdala to structures of the brainstem that control the emotional response, like the hypothalamus, and which then directs the sympathetic response. And of course, that activates the rest of the brain. We should note that the amygdala is not a singular structure. It's actually a cluster of nuclei. And we didn't really cover this too much, but I just kind of wanted to point this out, that the amygdala really is kind of a multi-function, really complex organ itself, right? But each of these regions serve different function, and they can be evidenced by studies of fear. Again, when we perform lesions on certain animalistic brains. Okay, so from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there's really a lot of work to be done surrounding the brain mechanisms of human emotion. It appears that the brain activity associated with each individual emotion is not highly localized, but really it's rather diffused. Okay, each emotion or even the experience of empathy when observing emotional states of others is accompanied by activity of the motor cortex and sensory cortex. And what do I mean by that? So if we say you're able to observe somebody else that's either smiling or maybe showing fear response, that activates portions of your brain that are similar, what we call mirroring in your brain to how it would be, the activity in your brain would be lit up the same as if you were producing that emotion yourself. So really interesting stuff in that area. And really, brain imaging studies have shown similar patterns of brain activity, whether you're experiencing themselves or observing somebody experiencing those emotions. All right. All right. So let's wrap up here with stress response. Let's talk about stress response, because the emotions really communicate how we feel, but what does stress have to do with that? And of course, looking at a person, you can tell whether they're engaged in stress or not. There's some negative impacts to stress, and there's some positive ones as well. But when the body is exposed to excessive harm or threat, it initiates physiological changes known as the stress response. These are really adaptive. We talked about evolutionary, adaptive changes in response to the stressor that are beneficial in the short term, but really they have adverse effects on the organism in the long run. So the response is centered around the anterior pituitary adrenal cortex system, better known as the HPA. Many of you that are going into biology be familiar with that term. It's going to be very common. I teach that also. There's a whole section of that in my biopsychology that I teach as well. So, but the HPA, it's a very common term. Stressors that stimulate the release of these corticotropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. They trigger the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. And these are signal molecules that produce many of the physiological effects of the stress response, right? And going back to what we talked about, or what we know about the sympathetic nervous system, this gets a little bit more in depth. And once those chemicals are released into our system, they go into our bloodstream and they carry throughout our body. And in this way, the release of, in this example, epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. So once they get into our bloodstreams, they start activating all these organs within our body. Our nervous impulse goes through our spinal cord to activate increased heart rate, for example, or converting glycogen to glucose within our liver, or decreasing digestive system, right? Because we're really trying to boost our energy in other areas of our body, like our heart or our lungs, to prepare us for fight or flight. So those are sort of some of the things that happen here within the adrenal system, okay? All right, so in that way, yeah, I mean, we can really look at this as the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis. The combination of these two, we can see in the two-system view of the stress response. That's what your book referred to as a two-system view. All right. So stress responses, they're very complex and they really vary from organism to organism or person to person, but we do know that certain common psychological stressors relating to, for example, jobs or relationships, or many of you, maybe a lot of homework or other social obligations, they can have effects that are similar to physical stressors, okay? In fact, studies have shown that social evaluative threat, which represents the context in which we ourselves feel like we're judged negatively by others. This is the most reliable stimulus for inducing an HPA axis response because it makes sense given the evolutionary importance of close relationships. We all value relationships in some way. So any threat to that kind of produces an unrealistic fear. There's not an actual threat there, but we feel like there's a threat. And many of you can tie that into if you have any kind of anxiety, like test anxiety or anxiety during dating or something like that. This is really what we're looking at with the social evaluative threat. All right. So what happens with excess amount of stress? Well, in this case, we can see certain disorders crop up, such as development of gastric ulcers. These are lesions in the stomach lining that can be very painful due to the high acidity of the gastric acid in the stomach, as well as the cardiometabolic disorders that might occur from that as well, right? So stress can even have an impact on our immune function. In a brief stressor, if we experience brief stressor, that can actually improve our innate immune function. But over time, we see that as being a negative thing. So if we have chronic stress, we're under constant stress for many, many months or many, many years, this can have an adverse effect on our adaptive immune function. It can actually reduce our immune system, which could leave us open and vulnerable to diseases and viruses and even other kind of illnesses, right? So the mechanism by which this occurs, we do know that there is a correlation between chronic stress and vulnerability to illnesses, but it seems clear that the two systems outlined in the stress response can influence the immune system. As T cells and B cells have receptors for these glucocorticoids and lymphocytes, they have receptors for these too. In addition, epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're also, their link does not really seem to be far-fetched from that either, okay? Now, when we look at, there is a field, an upcoming field that, not upcoming, I mean, it's very much here, but Psychoneuroimmunology, which looks at the nervous system, the interaction between the nervous system, immune system, and endocrine system, and how they all work together, all right? All right, so that's really all that I have for explaining the emotions, how emotions work. Now, your book really describes, it goes into different types of emotions theory. Again, I think it does a pretty good job explaining that, but I just kind of wanted to tie this in with what we talked about in the previous lesson with motivation and how that leads us to reducing stress, right? And of course, emotions, they're learned over time. We start learning them almost as a communication tool from as early as birth. But anyway, so with that, I'm going to kind of toss this out to all of you. What are some of your symptoms of stress? I would normally break us off into groups if we had enough people here, but what sort of things do you notice? We talked about ways to kind of pep us up or ramp us down from anxiety, but what sort of things do you feel are your physiological? How do you know when you're enduring some kind of stress? What happens?
My head starts to hurt.
Okay. So headaches, all right. So headaches, where do you think headaches come from? Where do you when we're experiencing stress? Anybody? Lively bunch today. So when we're experiencing stress, one of the first things I look at is where we're carrying our tension. Okay. When we're carrying our tension, we're shrugging our shoulders. We're kind of, again, we're engaging in that behavior, and that pinches nerves, that creates tension on the base of our spine and our base of our brain, and that might restrict flow to the brain, blood flow and oxygen even. So we might start experiencing stress right here in the back of our brain, and sometimes that could carry to the front and the temporal lobes. We also might be we might have the brow response. If we're experiencing stress, we might feel tension right here in our scalps, at the front of our scalps, and our temples and forehead. So kind of paying attention to where your brows are and relaxing those can be very, very helpful. So what I would like to do today is kind of just walk you through what some of these breathing techniques are like. And it seems kind of weird to do this at first, and maybe some of you have done this, but this is something that I really employ with my patients and clients that are experiencing high levels of stress or even panic. This is very helpful during panic situations. So any of you that are going into the field or may have experienced some level of panic yourself, this is very, very helpful. So what I'd like you all to do is find a place, hopefully you're sitting down, and if you're able to do so safely, sit down in your chair, okay? And just walk through it. Let me ask, does anybody not want to do this? Is anybody interested in learning how to do this?
Sure.
You're interested?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's give this a try. So what I'd like you to do is sit back in your chair, okay? Sit comfortably, feet flat on the floor. Maybe your back against the chair, kind of squared in your chair, not slumped over or leaning forward. And put your arms down to your side, maybe on the armchair, or if you don't have arms on your chair, maybe put them in your lap, okay? Now, sitting there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of walk you through what we're going to be doing. I'm going to have you close your eyes. I'm not going to worry. This is not hypnosis. I'm going to have you close your eyes and Chef Lay, I see you laughing. Have you close your eyes and just kind of pay attention. Visualize your body, right? Visualize where I'm talking about on your body. So go ahead now and close your eyes. All right. And as you're sitting there, kind of just let gravity take its toll on you. Release the tension on the back of your legs. Just let your arms hang down and pay attention to where you're holding that tension in your neck. I always ask people to kind of move their shoulders around, make sure that they're as low as possible. You don't have to force them down low, but just make sure that you're not bringing them up, because that takes muscle tension, especially in the back of your neck. So releasing all those muscles and just letting your arms hang and letting gravity do its work. Okay. So while you're doing that, also pay attention to the tension in your neck and kind of move your head from side to side. And then maybe do that 2 or 3 times, move it around, and then move it clockwise. Move your head around clockwise and just release that tension in the back of your neck. Okay. And then once you get a couple clockwise moves in, do some counterclockwise. And the whole purpose of that is to, again, that's where we carry a lot of our stress. And if we can start reducing that muscle tension, we could start tricking our sympathetic nervous system to think that there's no danger here and we're relaxed. All right. Now, the other area that we're going to focus on is breathing, because when we tend to get worked up, we forget to breathe, or we stop breathing. That's a mechanism to prevent us from missing something important in our environment, because if we're breathing heavy, we hear that internally and that creates an internal noise. So pay attention to your breathing. Again, it may stop during high tension or even panic situations. That's what creates the lightheadedness sometimes. So what I'm going to give you the instructions first, and then I'll walk you through and we'll practice it together. So the instructions are this: you're going to breathe in, you're going to take a nice deep breath in through your nose and count for 3 seconds. It should take 3 seconds for you to start breathing in to fill up your entire your lungs and your belly with air. And I know I say your belly, you don't really breathe into your belly, but you're going to pay attention to your belly swelling. Okay, so 3 seconds in, we're going to hold it for 2 or 3 seconds, and then we're going to let it out through our mouth. Okay, for 3 seconds. Nice slow in, nice slow out. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Okay, so let's give that a try right now. So with your eyes closed and pay attention to your shoulders dropped, we're going to breathe in through our nose for 3 seconds. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Nice big breath in and hold it. And then out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you got it? So let's give that another try. This time, each time, try doing a deeper breath in and letting it all out. Leave nothing left in you. Okay, so let's try that again. In through your nose. 1, 2, 3. Hold it. And then release out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3. And the whole time, just letting gravity take its toll on your body. Just let everything hang down, feet flat on the floor, hands relaxed. And as we breathe in again, 1, 2, 3, hold it. And then out through your mouth, 1, 2, 3. All right, let's do one more of these. And this time, let's take our biggest breath that we could possibly do. But this time, I want you to think of your favorite color. It could be, like, for me, I think of my favorite color is green. So green means calm. For my least favorite color is red. And I look at things that are red as being a little bit more negative, kind of bad energy. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to picture those two colors, your favorite color and a color that represents kind of negativity for you, okay, or negative energy. And you're gonna breathe in that calm color in through your nose, kind of visualize breathing in that nice, calm, relaxing color in through your nose. And then we're going to hold it, and it's going to gather up all the negative energy, and then we're going to breathe it out through our mouth. And just imagine whatever color it is that represents negativity for you. Imagine that coming out of you. Okay. So what we're doing is we're visualizing taking in the good air, letting it flush out our system, and taking out the bad air. Okay. You with me so far? So let's give that a try. With the breathing exercise, we're going to take a nice deep breath in through our nose, whatever nice, cool, crisp, clean air. 1, 2, 3. Let it flourish around inside you and gather up all your worries and fears and concerns. And then let it out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Let's give that another try. Let's try and this time get up all of the worries and fears and concerns that we have in the world and get it out of our system on this next one. All right. So let's picture your favorite color surrounding you as you breathe in through your nose. 1, 2, 3. Gather up all the worries and fears and concerns of your world and let it out. Imagine that negative energy leaving your body through your mouth. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is just kind of pay attention to where you are right now, where your head is, how relaxed your body is, and try and carry that with you for the rest of the day. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to count back from 3 as you come back in. So 3 is paying attention to your relaxed state right now and how you feel. 2, getting kind of back, you're paying attention to the sounds around you, coming back into the real world around you. And then 1, go ahead and slowly open your eyes as you look around the room and you're present in the here and now. All right, how do y'all feel?
I feel relaxed.
Okay, these are little tricks that I use, and I always say, so going back to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, our bodies only activate like from the time that our mind is triggered to tell us to start producing those fear response. It only takes us no more than about 10 or 15 minutes to get everything back to calm. Some of us with practice can do it a lot sooner than that, but for the most part, that's really all it takes. Now, we get into that feedback loop where our mind triggers our body and our body triggers our mind, and it just goes back and forth. And so it might seem like it lasts for hours, but once you can kind of settle your mind down and get that parasympathetic system kicked in, it really only takes about 10 minutes to calm down. So this is a great way for either if you want to use it yourself or provide it to a family member, or if you're going to work with clients or patients later in your career. This is a great way to just have them go off into a place that's quiet and relaxing and practice that, because it really lowers that aggressive tendency or defensive tendency for that matter. Okay. How'd y'all like that? Was that pretty good? Was that fun?
That was great, especially like for my neck, because like I kind of like realized that my neck was a little stiff, and then when I
Yeah.
did the exercise, it kind of like made me relax, and it was good.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and hopefully that's something that you can use or pass on to other people. Right. All right. Any questions for me? All right. So I'm going to stop.